Okay.
You're the host. Go.
Okay. Hello. My name is Sori O'Brien. This is my second latte of the day. And this is Jonacast, a podcast where Jonathan talks about his upcoming concerts with the Sunnyside Symphony Orchestra, and talks about the composers and the music and all that good stuff. So
It's been a little while since we did this.
yeah,
We look older.
we were gonna do one every month.
Yeah, that was so originally. So the first episode we did was on the Emmanuel Symphony, which we premiered in December of 2024.
Yeah.
It is now March 2025, almost April. So it's been a few months.
Yeah. And that episode is up on YouTube, by the way, as our first episode. That was a long time ago, but we have a baby, and we are both, what's the word?
Lazy. It's hard doing a podcast.
We're both improved procrastinators. And
I think we can do this more often, though. I think
we just need to schedule it. It helps that now traditionally we are going to go to Elmer's after every podcast episode. And so
it's a new tradition. We've done it
It's
one
a
time.
new tradition. So that will encourage me to put it on the schedule because I freaking love pancakes.
Well, basically the way this works is if you make me do the podcast, then we'll do it. And so I'll talk about music, if given the chance. So that's what we're doing today. Today, what are we talking about?
We're talking about the planets.
The planets, Holst. So this is like a piece that almost needs no introduction, except for that there's actually a lot about it that people don't know. I think it's just a really famous piece. Like, people hear it and they know it, but there's a lot of interesting background about it. So we can get into that. We can get into Holst. Holst is one of those composers. He's kind of one of classical music's one-hit wonders, in the sense that he's really intensely known for one work, which is the planets.
Yeah, because I haven't really heard of Holst other than from this piece. And before we get too far into it, Sunnyside Symphony, the reason we're talking about the planets is because the Sunnyside Symphony is doing the planets, and you have to go see the concert. It's going to be on Star Wars Day, May 4th, so it's easy to remember. May the 4th be with you. And it's at 4 p.m. on Sunday at the Sunnyside Seventh-day Adventist Church in Southeast Portland. So come see the concert.
And it's free.
It's free. This is like one of the best pieces ever. And if you don't know the piece, you wouldn't know that. Or like if you're not like a classical music person. But like when I tell you this is like one of the best pieces ever, like everybody comes out to see it. It's inspired so many movie scores. So anyways, Jonathan, back to you.
Well,
tell us about Holst.
One thing that was interesting, actually, just about this piece. So you work at the Eugene Symphony. You told me that since they're doing the piece also this season.
Yes, they are.
You told me that behind the scenes.
Behind
the
scenes. Yeah. I think I can share this because whatever. But like, I work at the Eugene Symphony, and so I was telling Jonathan, like, I see the ticket numbers, and I'm like, Jonathan, this concert is selling almost like triple the amount of our last concerts. Like, is the planets like that popular, that famous? And he was like, yeah.
Yeah,
everybody goes out to see it.
People love the planets. And so I just think that's such an interesting little like behind the scenes peek for that orchestra, like just to see the kind of numbers the planets does.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see out of our ticket buyers who are like first time ticket buyers,
right.
Like they haven't bought a ticket for any of our other concerts except this concert. I'd be curious to see. I work as like the data coordinator at the Eugene Symphony, so I'm always like looking at the numbers and stuff. But anyways, it just goes to show that this is like everyone comes out to see this piece.
Yes, the planets, it's a really interesting piece, and it's a very influential piece. I think maybe somewhat appropriately, since we're playing the piece on Star Wars Day, but the planets had a huge influence on the soundtrack to Star Wars.
Yep.
Not many people know, but the planets, along with some other pieces like The Rite of Spring, were used as temp music when John Williams was scoring Star Wars. It's one of the first films that heavily used what's now common practice in Hollywood, which is temp tracks. So like they'll
what is that?
So basically, when they make a movie, they don't have music yet, but when they're putting a rough cut together, oftentimes they'll get some temp music in there, just to kind of help them cut it, and then they'll have
to get like the vibe of the what kind of music would go with that.
And actually, it's caused some problems, you know, in the world of Hollywood film composing, because very often composers are asked to match the temp music really closely, like to the point where it just starts to sound like a ripoff. And you can listen to side-by-side comparisons. If you go on, you know, YouTube and search around, you can find some, you know, basically situations where composers are forced to essentially copy the music of another composer, because if they don't get, you know, if a director cuts too closely to the temp music and gets too like married to the feeling in their head of the temp music, sometimes they can't use it for legal reasons, but they really want that track that they cut the film to originally.
Yeah.
So temp music is kind of, there's pluses and minuses to it, but it's a common thing that's done in film composing. And Star Wars was one of the first films to use it a lot, and the Music of the Planets was one of the pieces of music that George Lucas used when he created his rough cuts of Star Wars. And so when John Williams wrote the music, you know, there are parts of that score where you can really hear Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring. There's parts of that score you can really hear the Music of the Planets. So it's not only in that film, but then going forward, it's an extremely important and influential piece of music. You know, you'll hear Mars, the opening movement, in film trailers, and just it's a huge pop cultural touchstone, because there's something about these pieces of music, each of the movements of the planets, that is so accessible. You know, we'll get into the music itself, but each movement has its own character, and they're extremely expressive and evocative pieces, and so it's really easy as an audience member to connect with the mood that Holst is going for, and so it's not a surprise to me, especially with the first movement, that you see this piece crop up, because it has some kind of emotional, visceral feeling that it's not many composers are able to capture that sort of feeling. And I think this piece does it really well. So let's back up a little bit. Let's first talk about the composer. So Gustav Holst. I found out his first name is actually Gustavus, which is even more pretentious. And actually, he was also von Holst, because his father's side came from a number of different places in Europe, but there was definitely a German, component to his heritage. Oh. His mother was mostly British, and of course he was born in England.
Okay.
And
I thought he was German.
No, he was British, and his grandfather, I believe, is the one who moved to England. But he had, I think his grandfather had lived in Russia, actually. So there was a Russian element, but mostly his heritage was German and British. And the von Holst was, so if you don't know, in German, von, V-O-N, is a prefix to a last name that denotes noble heritage, like you're a nobleman, which is like, if you look at like Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the issues Beethoven had was that people thought that V-A-N was the same as von, but the Flemish fan is actually does not denote nobility, and Beethoven actually ran into some trouble towards the end of his life because he was involved in some legal disputes, and he was in the noble court, and then they found out he wasn't a noble, and they kicked him down to the commoner court, and that judge was not as favorable towards him. That's a separate story. But the Holsts were also not noble. His grandfather, I think it was his grandfather, who added the von to Holst just to try and make himself seem more noble. Because he thought it would get him more music students.
That's another bad high five.
Yeah. Cut. We had to stop because the baby came home with her grandmother.
Yeah.
And now she's sleeping, so
Yep.
we'll see how that goes. So we were talking about names, and how basically the Holsts added the von to their name just to try and make themselves seem a little bit more fancy to the British people so that they could get more music students. Holst, there was at least one prominent musician in each kind of generation of his family, going back a few generations. So there was definitely a musical background. His father was a musician, he played the piano and taught music. So he grew up around music and was encouraged to play music. Interestingly enough, his father didn't necessarily want him to be a composer. I think he thought he was going to be a professional pianist. And Holst himself wanted to be a pianist. He also studied a little bit of violin, but didn't like it very much. Unfortunately, he had some kind of neurological issues that caused tingling in his right arm, and so it kind of prevented him from really pursuing the piano, even though he really enjoyed playing the piano. And he was a decent pianist, although not a virtuoso, partly because of this limitation that he had. But as time went on, Holst's father, Adolf, sort of softened his stance, and Gustav Holst became, started to pursue composing and was able to get some lessons. When he left school, he went to Oxford for a few years to study with a composition teacher there. And following that, he enrolled at the Royal Academy of Music in London, which was it was the meeting place of all the top young composers of the day. And it's there that he met Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was a close friend of his, who was just a couple years older than him, as well as a few other, prominent British composers such as George Butterworth. And so it was there that Holst really found his place. He struggled at first to find success with his compositions. Some of them were more successful than others, but he wasn't able to make a living. And so he turned to teaching, as many musicians do. And from the sound of it, he was a really fabulous teacher. He was just really kind of a patient, kind teacher. He was very, with his composition students, he wasn't a overbearing sort of teacher. He wouldn't, say, oh, you have to do it this way, and let me write this for you. He was very much the sort of teacher that would try to lead you towards your own solution.
Does he have any famous students?
Not that I know of, but he was. There were a few of his students. So he also taught music in several schools, especially schools for girls. This is a common thing with the British composers of that time. Other composers like Elgar also taught at girls' schools,
boarding school type thing.
It was a common sort of thing, for. I would imagine they're more upper class sort of institutions. And so a lot of these schools had really strong music programs. And so there were a few of his students who, there was at least one student who went on to become a well-known soprano, or that sort of thing. So, but he didn't necessarily have any strong, composition students that went on and became famous. Although he, was a big supporter of women's education. He was sort of a progressive. So Holst, he was part of some socialist movements. He wasn't like a communist, but he definitely was an advocate towards, more left-leaning policies, and he was a vegetarian. He was he was
Wow, that must have been so hard to be a vegetarian back in those days.
I don't know, maybe, but he was definitely.
Just eating potatoes.
I don't know. He was interested in, left-leaning politics. He was interested in the music of India, that sort of thing. So maybe he would have been a bit of a hippie if he was born at a different time.
Yeah.
But he was a kind of a soft-spoken, quiet sort, kept to himself, and seemed like he was a really genuine, nice person. And so, like I said, his composing, he didn't find huge amounts of success with it, but his career still moved forward, and he became a strong part of that whole milieu and that whole, British, English.
Sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but did he was he mostly an educator then, rather than composer?
Well, yes and no. So he kind of found his place and certainly made his living teaching. But he was composing, and he was spending time with the other composers of the day.
Right.
And so he wrote the planets a little bit before he started writing it right before World War One broke out. And so he was born in to back up. Holst was born in 1874 and died in 1934. And so he was of a fighting age when World War One broke out. The kind of early-ish 1900s, before the war, there was a renaissance of British folk or English folk music, and you'll hear that in the music of Vaughan Williams and other, Elgar and Holst and these and Butterworth, these composers, British composers of that time. There was a huge interest in bringing back the kind of cultural music of the English folk music, and so Holst was a big part of that. By the time he got to the planets, he was kind of moving into his own direction. So he didn't get as into the English folk music as, say, Vaughan Williams did, but it was definitely a part of his compositional process and part of the texture of his musical language. And you'll hear it especially in the most famous melody of the planets, which is Jupiter.
Right.
In the middle of that movement, there's a famous melody that really has the character of a hymn. That you can hear the ties to this kind of English folk music that was so popular with the young composers of that time. So when the war broke out, Holst tried to enlist, but he was not considered to be fit for combat duty. His whole life he was very sickly. Not only did he have this neurological issue that caused the tingling, he also had really poor eyesight, which I imagine was a big part of why he was not accepted.
Yeah, maybe he should have been eating some meat.
Hey, now, there's no evidence. In fact, he became a vegetarian after he had these issues. He had these issues preceding that. So let's just not poop on the vegetarians, okay?
Yeah, I was once a vegetarian. Just ate a lot of bread. It was great.
Regardless, Holst was not able to enlist, and it's an interesting thing because, you listen to the first movement of the planets, the bringer of war, Mars, and it's often cited as kind of maybe an example of the horrors of World War One, but it was actually written before the start of the war, and you could say that it has in some sense, it seems to predict the horrors of that war, because unlike many other battle pieces that you'd hear, what's so remarkable about Mars, and I think one of the reasons that it's really stayed in our culture, is it really depicts the horror of war. It's this very militaristic and scary piece of music, which is not really in keeping, like I say, with many of the battle pieces that you'd hear. That being said, Holst tried to enlist, and I think that, looking back, now that we know how horrific World War One was, I can't imagine wanting to fight in that war.
Yeah.
But it was, Holst really tried to get into the war and was really disappointed that he wasn't able to go.
Interesting.
Vaughan Williams was able to serve in the war, and of course Butterworth, another one of their group, died in the war. So, it was definitely the thing to do at the time.
Like his buddies were going and
and so
serving king and country.
Yeah, so the premiere of the planets is interesting because it towards the end of the war, Holst finally got an opportunity to at least be involved. He was hired by the YMCA, actually, to be sent to a city in Greece to work with soldiers in a musical capacity. And so he ended up going and doing that. And before he left, he was given an opportunity to use a prominent local music hall and a prominent orchestra to premiere something. And so he basically had an opportunity to put on the planets for a private concert. And so he rushed into Adrian Bolt's office, who's a conductor, famous conductor, and said, "We get to do the planets. you're going to conduct it. Like, this is happening. So it was very exciting. And so there was a private sort of performance on. The musicians literally had 2 hours to prepare the music. They were able to rehearse. Since he worked at a girls' school, they were able to get the women's choir together to and prepare that. But it's an interesting story that they just kind of were able to, on short notice, put the planets together.
Was it good?
I don't know.
Who were the musicians?
So it was a professional orchestra.
It wasn't the soldiers that he was teaching.
No. This was in London before he left.
Oh, okay.
So anyways, the piece was actually written kind of over the course of the war. So as I mentioned, he started it shortly before, in 1914, before the war began.
Yeah.
And the planets is interesting because the idea for it came when he was in Spain visiting some friends. He was invited to spend some time in Spain to kind of recover from a failed premiere of another work. He had another work that didn't go so well, and so he was feeling depressed, and so he went to Spain on holiday, as the British say. And while he was there, his friends introduced him to the idea of astrology, and he became interested in astrology. And apparently he became very proficient in the telling of horoscopes. So he was a vegetarian, horoscope reading, left-leaning.
Oh yeah! Oh, this is great. This is great. Yeah.
And
just
so
imagine what
the
he would
planets,
be like
the idea behind the planets is as much astrological as it is. It's
right.
more. In fact, more has to do with astrology than it has to do with the actual physical planets. Astronomy was not a well-developed science in those days as it is now. Now we know all about the actual planets.
Right.
And we have photos of them, and we've sent space probes and whatnot. But in those days, it was all just like looking through a telescope, and even that was not as well developed of a science. But Holst's interest in the planets was really based in astrology, and so you can see that in the titles of each of the movements. So it's not just Mars; it's Mars, the bringer of war. Then you have Venus, the bringer of peace; Mercury, the winged messenger; Jupiter, the bringer of jollity, right? And then you have Saturn, the bringer of old age; Uranus, the magician; and then finally Neptune, the mystic. And of course Pluto's not there because Pluto had not been discovered yet. And of course now there's all this controversy with Pluto. Is it even really a planet? So now Pluto...
Is it even a planet?
Pluto now is considered like a dwarf planet, and so it's been taken off the list of planets anyways. So it used to be that...
Back in my day,
well, it's
Pluto
funny.
was a planet, damn it.
It's funny because... So the planets was written before Pluto was discovered.
Right.
And so then after Pluto was discovered, there were other composers who actually wrote their own version of Pluto because we have to have a complete set. And of course now, the irony is that Pluto is no longer a planet, and so now Holst's planets is complete once more.
Yeah, that's great.
No editing needed. No extra movements needed.
Question, and I don't know if it's on there or not, but are the movements tied to the sign? Because you know how each sign has a planet? I
don't know, because I am not into astrology.
Yeah, okay, I was just curious.
But
it was in there.
I do know that the inspiration is tied into astrology. And I don't know if there's different schools of astrology and if there's different ways of doing it. Couldn't care less, honestly.
Yeah.
It's not my thing. But Holst was interested in it.
Yeah.
He called it his pet vice. So I think he understood that it was a little bit... I'm not going to say stupid, all right? I'm sure there's vegetarians who like astrology out there. We're going to make them all bad. Listen, if you're into astrology, more power to you. It's not my thing. But, it's interesting because the associations of each movement are not all necessarily the associations that you would draw based on the Roman gods that the names are associated with. So, Mars, yes, is the god of war. That seems fairly straightforward. But if you look at Greek and Roman mythology, Venus is the god of love, not the bringer of peace. But you look at the way the Holst wrote the movement, and it's very much, no, this is a movement about peace. Yeah. It's not about love. Then you have Mercury, the winged messenger. Once more, that's directly taken from Greek and Roman mythology. But then you look at Jupiter, Jupiter or Zeus, the king of the gods, not the bringer of jollity. That's not really the association you would draw with juice.
With juice.
Juice. Maybe we do need a new movement. You could write a new movement for the planets called Juice.
Juice.
Yeah, so Jupiter,
King of the gods.
King of the yummy drinks. Jupiter, in Holst's version, the bringer of jollity, but you would never look at the Roman god Jupiter and think, oh yeah, jolly. And like Jupiter was always like sneaking out on his wife and like doing blasting people with his thunderbolts.
Yeah.
And he's not really the jolly guy.
Yeah.
There are other gods. You would look at maybe Dionysus or something. But Bacchus, I guess. I don't know which one's the Roman version. I think Dionysus is the Greek version and Bacchus is the Roman version. I don't actually know.
I don't know.
Regardless, he's not in there. Then you have Saturn, the bringer of old age. I don't actually know what Saturn would be the god of. But, in other words, these associations are based in astrology, which I think has some inspiration from the Roman gods, but it's not a one-to-one. And so that's why some of them sort of line up with the gods that you'd think of, and some of them don't.
Yeah.
Is because he's working off a different model. He's working off this astrological concept of these planets. That being said, I do think that there's something of the idea of space and the planets themselves that's still present in these works. So they're not just these kind of character pieces, although they also, just in the scale of the way that Holst wrote the movements and the sense of space and majesty, I do think he was also attempting to capture the feeling of these great, mysterious worlds that are beyond our reach. And also just in the way that the piece ends. The piece fades out, off into infinity, in the same way that space goes on forever. And so, I do think, because you'll hear these pieces also commonly used, like if you ever watch literally any documentary about space and the planets, they always use Holst, because it feels so appropriate.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is this feeling of outer space that really is conveyed in these pieces.
Yeah, and that's certainly sort of the interpretation that I think a lot of audience members feel too when they listen to this music.
Yes. So I don't think it's just astrology. I do think that the planets themselves are well represented in this piece.
They're in there.
And I think that's partly, you're right, why this piece has become so popular and so enduring is because it does tap into that. There's a few pieces like that in the repertoire that tap into this sort of universal idea. Like, for instance, you could look at Vivaldi in the Four Seasons. That's a piece that just seems to capture something. We all can relate to the Four Seasons, and Vivaldi just found something that he really...
The sound of,
it
tapped into the sound of the universe.
Exactly. And so I think the Planets does that, and so I think that's one of the reasons it's become so popular. It's not just the music, although the music, it wouldn't be so popular if the music wasn't so great, but I think also the concept behind the piece is a huge part of why the piece has become so popular. So following the Planets, so the first performance was sort of a private, invite-only sort of performance on short notice. And then Adrian Bolt premiered several of the movements, but not the whole piece, in a more public way. In his opinion, he felt the piece was too new and too radical to give to an audience all at once. And he may have been right, because some of the first reviews were not positive, but rapidly people got used to it, and it quickly turned around and became enormously popular, to the point where it catapulted Holst into international fame, which was not something that he was prepared for or expecting, and it did not suit his personality. So he refused interviews, he'd never signed autographs, he was not interested. He wanted to kind of keep his head down and compose his pieces of music. It's said that he in his later years felt that the craze around the planets was overblown, and he didn't feel like it was his best work, and he wanted his other music to be more appreciated. And I think, on the one hand, I think that's completely silly, because the Planet is obviously his best work. But you can understand it from his perspective, because first of all, there may have been just a lot of associations with the kind of insanity around the planets. He was invited to America to premiere the work, and it put him in this position that he wasn't ready for or used to, and so I think he may have felt a little bit beset upon by the planet's craze, and so that might have been part of his thinking in saying, well, this is not really warranted. But also, his style shifted after the planets, and his music became a little bit more more experimental and more like he wrote a lot of things that are a little bit more internal, and they don't have that external appeal the planets have, and so critics were kind of disappointed by the follow-ups to the planets. They felt like, oh, this is just kind of boring, and it didn't have that universality that the planets has.
Yeah. It's kind of like like when a band plays and they're like, play Dire Maker, which is a song by the way.
Free Bird.
Yeah, Free Bird. And it's like, and they've like written other music at this point, and it's like, can we just, they have to play. Everybody wants to hear the hits.
Yeah, and so I think Holst kind of had a chip on his shoulder based on that. He's a victim of his own success.
Interesting.
But he.
I'm just gonna move this chair a little bit because my neck's hurting.
It's craning over at me.
Yeah, it's an old. Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, so that's kind of the rundown on Holst, the short version of his biography. He died, I would say, not super old. He had heart failure and died, but definitely his biggest legacy is this piece. So let's get into the music. So there are 7 movements, and the first is the most famous, which is Mars, the bringer of war. And what this movement is really, it's interesting the way he organizes the piece overall, because he doesn't do it in order. In his initial sketches, he labels Mercury as number 1, and so it may have been that his original idea was to put the planets in order of distance from the sun. But he scrapped that, and I think for musical reasons, because Mars is definitely the right place to begin this piece. You just start right with the coolest, most attention-grabbing movement.
That's interesting. I feel like a lot of composers kind of do start from the beginning and then keep composing, but I mean, is that true?
He actually composed Mercury towards the end, but it may have been that his intention was still to put it first in terms of when you hear it. But composers work in different ways. Sometimes they work from the beginning and work towards the end. There are many composers, like for instance opera composers, who would write the entire opera and then go back and write the overture. Right. By the way, Holst himself wrote many operas, many of which are not really known, but he wrote multiple operas.
Really?
Yeah, it's true. But and some of them were moderately successful.
English?
Yes, in English.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so you could look into that. But Mars, the first movement, you could say it makes sense for it to be the first because it's the closest planet to Earth, and then from there he goes kind of towards the sun. So he goes Mars, which is, I think Mars is farther away from the sun than Earth, but it's the closest to Earth. So he starts with Mars, kind of going away from the sun, and then he goes back to Venus, back towards the sun, and then Mercury, which is the closest to the sun. And then from there he jumps back out to Jupiter, and from there he goes in order of distance from the sun. So it's a little bit of a mess. There's also no Earth movement, which, if you wanted to add something to this piece, I suppose you could do Earth, but that's kind of stupid. I think it's nice that he didn't do Earth, because how do you sum up Earth? It doesn't have, and of course with astrology it wouldn't make sense, because astrology is all about the other planets. Yeah. But so that's probably the biggest reason there's no Earth, is because it doesn't make any sense in terms of astrology.
Yeah.
So the bringer of war, musically this is a very interesting movement because it's all based in groupings of 5. So most pieces of music that you will ever hear are either in 4 beats per measure, or sometimes 2 beats per measure, which is kind of like 4, just grouped a little differently, or 3 beats. So groups of 3 or groups of 4 are the most common. What's not common are measures of 5. And a 5 bar can be divided generally either a group of 3 and a group of 2, or a group of 2 and a group of 3. So it can either be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or it can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then very rarely there'll be pieces of music such as the waltz movement from Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, da 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 dee da dee da da, that actually have groupings in both directions.
Yeah.
So Tchaikovsky actually,
which is so fun to sing.
yeah, Tchaikovsky actually does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, or I guess he goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So he does like a group of 3 and 2, and then 2 and 3. So that's less standard. What Holst does here is he sticks basically with 3 plus 2 the whole time. So you'll hear this rhythm. Wait for this to turn on. It goes 1, 2, da 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 da. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this movement is based around that. So you'll hear that rhythm going pretty much the entire time. In the percussion and the lower strings, and over the top of that we have these kind of slowly building chords in the brass in particular. So here, we start with.
While you play that?
You want to try?
Yeah, okay. Wait, which one note is
The
it?
G.
This one? Okay, ready? Oh, so fun. So fun.
So, yeah, so that is basically how it works. And you'll notice that it doesn't always harmonically match. So the rhythm that you hear is on a G, and it's a pedal tone, which is a term that comes from the pipe organ. So a pipe organ has, there's multiple manuals or keyboards for your hands, and then there's the pedals for your feet. You play them with your feet, so you're doing everything all at once. And in like the music of Bach, they'll have what's called a pedal tone. So like at the end of a fugue, as a piece is coming to an end, they'll just hold the dominant pitch as a long held note, and a bunch of harmonies will shift over the top of it, but the pedal doesn't change.
Yeah.
And so you could have this note here.
Yeah.
Clashes, but in context, it just feels.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as clashing.
Yeah.
And so pedal tones will often be used to kind of put a bedrock underneath a bunch of other shifting harmonies. And it's an effect that you'll hear in many different romantic composers and modern composers. And so it has its origins in Baroque music, but Holst makes really good use of it here.
I feel like the really famous one is the organ symphony. Is it the third movement where you just hear, like you don't even hear the organ really, but there's just a pedal tone throughout the movement?
No, that piece doesn't have a pedal tone, but I would say this is a great example of a famous pedal tone. Now, it does eventually shift away from a G, so it does eventually go up to a C, which is like the normal way that a pedal would resolve, is up by fourth or down by fifth. But what's really cool about the way that he writes this is and then throughout the planets, Holst has a lot of interest in bitonality and polytonality, which is something that you'll see in the music of Debussy, who was an influence. Holst's most early influence was Wagner, and you'll hear that in here too. Wagner and Strauss were both big influences for Holst, and then he became more interested in this kind of English folk music, so he brought in some of those influences, and he also loved the music of Ravel, so you could hear the brilliance of Ravel. Now, Holst was not just a pianist, he also played the trombone, actually played it professionally, because it was a little easier for him to play with his condition. And so he, besides teaching, made some money, especially in his early years, playing as a professional trombone player. And so he was an orchestral musician. And so that first-hand experience of playing in an orchestra really informed the way that he wrote his pieces. He always made sure that they were performable, and there's some great brass parts in this movement in particular, but throughout the piece. There's some great brass stuff. As basically, you just have these really strange harmonies over this G pedal, and you get this, like, you know, this clashing harmonies. This is the kind of polytonality, where this kind of G harmony, and then this A flat, which is a half step off. This kind of clashing of chords, you'll hear this throughout the whole piece, not just Mars. So we have a big build up to the first climax, and then everything when the full orchestra finally comes in, we switch to C. So we have a big, you know, build up here with a finally shifts the pedal note as everyone finally arrives. And from here, we get a really interesting metric choice. He creates a hemiola. So hemiola is a rhythm that doesn't fit in the overall meter, right? So a classic example would be if we're, like, let's say we're doing a piece that's in 6/8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you'd have a measure that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That would be a hemiola. In other words, it's a way of grouping the notes that feels like it's contrary to the prevailing rhythmic structure. And so what Holst does here is he's got this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he creates basically a hemiola of groups of 2. So da dee da dee da dee da dee da. And what that actually does is it creates almost a super structure of 10 rather than 5, right? Because if you divide it 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's groups of 2 over the space of 2 full 5 bars.
Yeah.
Now, that means that they're right at the bar line, in between those 2 bars, there's no note. So it goes D, 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 which means this movement is extremely hard to conduct.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say it's one of the hardest things I've ever had to conduct. Because what you hear and what you have to feel in your body are completely disconnected, right? Because the first note starts on the beat, D, 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 and then the beat 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 comes in between the beats, as well as the downbeat of the second measure, which is very hard. You have to go 1, 2, 3, 4. D D D D D D D D D D D D D D D D D D. It's just really, really weird.
Yeah.
Right? And so as a conductor, it's like where you're patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time.
Yeah.
Wait, pat the head. Can't even do that, see? So how am I supposed to conduct this piece? So it's been hard work. And then when you conduct it, if you conducted it in 5, which some people do, it's not necessarily easier because the pattern also feels weird because you have to go da 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 dee da dee 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 dee. So it just feels very.
Can your brain sort of reset when you get to 10?
No, because you have to show the downbeat and you have to show the correct orientation for the orchestra. Otherwise, they don't know what to do.
No, I mean, like, once you do 2 measures of 5 with that weird, like, that is it like, okay, now we're at 10, now I have to go again?
Kind of, yeah. So basically there's 2 places where I line up with the orchestra.
Right.
Which is at the beginning of the first measure and then the last beat of the second measure.
Which is beat 10,
because I go
right?
Da dee 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 dee. That last 2 groups, beat 4 out of the, so it's beat 9 out of 10. I play with.
Yeah,
with
yeah.
me, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where I can, mentally for me at least, where I can line up with them.
Oh, God.
Because to conduct it, really what you have to do is you just have to think about where am I with them and where do they play in between my beat. So I think of it almost like a syncopation, right? So where it's off the beat. So I'm going with them, D, 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 D D D D D D D.
So
and
for those of you who are like, what's that guy doing just waving his arms up there? He's not even playing an instrument. This is what he's doing.
oh my god, it's so hard.
Yeah.
And of course
he has to be right so that all the orchestra is right.
now, even if I conduct it correctly, it's hard for them to follow it because of the way he wrote it. And so it's tricky to put together. Now, once you find that point where it gels, it does kind of go, but it's deceptively tricky.
Yeah.
Now, what's really interesting about this movement, so we have this kind of really interesting hemiola that's going on in the brass and building an energy. You may also, if you listen very carefully, hear the sound of the pipe organ. So this piece does actually feature the pipe organ. The Planets is one of the most densely orchestrated pieces in the entire repertoire. We're falling off the stage trying to play this thing.
Yeah.
So a standard orchestra would have 2, maybe 3 of each woodwind, and then they'd have 2, maybe 3 trumpets, 3 trombones and a tuba, strings, maybe some percussion. Every now and then they'll use the piano, but
or harp.
Harp, exactly. This piece has 4 of each woodwind. It has 4 trumpets, still 3 trombones, but then not just tuba. There's also euphonium, which is a tenor tuba. It uses instruments that don't really exist. In particular, it uses the bass oboe, which is an instrument that barely exists. It does exist, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
And we are actually going to have a bass oboe with this performance, which is really exciting. Many performances of the Planets are forced to use other instruments to cover the bass oboe parts because they can't find a bass oboe player. But we do have someone lined up to play it, so I'm really excited about that.
That's great.
It's got 2 piccolos, bass oboe, as I said. There's euphonium, which is not commonly used in orchestra. 6 horns instead of usually there's 4 horns. There's 6 horns in this. Yes. So and then 2 harps, not just 1 harp, 2 harps. Huge.
Piano?
It doesn't actually use piano, but it does use, as I started to say, the pipe organ. So the organ, you don't always hear it exactly because he really uses it at big moments.
Yeah.
He really makes good use of the pedals, but if you listen for it, it is there, and there are some great moments where the organ comes in. So that's also really exciting because of course we have a fantastic organ on stage at the Sunnyside Seventh-day Adventist Church. And as our viewers who are concert goers may remember, last season we finished our season with the organ symphony, the third symphony of Camille Saint-Saëns.
That's such a great concert.
Yes. So it's exciting to be able to use the organ whenever we can.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to incorporating that as well. But you'll hear it. So one of the figures you hear in this, we have D D D D D D D ya-dum bi-da-da-da-da-yum ba-da-da-dee. Those big chords going into the downbeat that repeat themselves. The organ comes in on those. So let me put on my organ voice. I can actually. Oh, that's not the right organ. That's not what we're looking for.
Play ball.
Okay. That's more like it. So we get, So it's this really exciting sound, the use of the organ. All right, so following this kind of opening section, there's a middle section, well, a couple kind of middle sections. So we move away from our G's and C's in the bass line and go to a G flat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have a nice dum-da-dee.
Yeah.
This melody in the kind of a counter melody.
What
all right?
instrument's playing that?
So it starts out with the euphonium. Ba 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 da 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 dee.
Yeah.
Ba dee da ba da 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 dee da da. Which is what's interesting about it is the movement starts with this kind of tattoo of 5. Da, 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 da. Something is coming. Something's very scary. And then we have these kind of foreboding, all right, and horror and clashing chords. Right? This kind of hemiola that we've been talking about does have some of this kind of traditional military sound, right? the sound kind of evoking military bands.
Yeah.
And I think this middle section also does that. Da 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 ya da 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 dee ram ba dee da 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 da. It's meant to be more traditional combat battle music. So he's taking those kind of touchstones, cultural touchstones of this military music, and infusing it with this sense of horror.
Right.
So it kind of goes back. You know, this middle section I think is a little more lighthearted because it's
it
kind of,
sounds a little bit more comical.
yeah. Well, it's meant, I think, to connect it with that sort of more traditional military music style.
Yeah.
But it still has a sense of urgency, especially as the violins come in. They have a nice little scale. Specifically, I'm gonna play this. It's a little bit more optimistic, and then we have a section where the basically we have a cannon in the brass, dun dun da 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 dee, and the trumpet comes over the top, da 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 diddly diddly dee, and they're alternating between the two of them. See, I have it right now. 1 second, please. Yeah, be fine. Okay, so we go. I can't play it. Go listen to this on YouTube. Go listen to it on YouTube. My piano playing's not going to do it justice. But essentially, we have the tenor tube or the euphonium alternating with the trumpets in canon. So the trumpet comes in with the same material 1 bar later, and it overlaps itself with this material. I can try and play it one time. You get the idea. Da-da-dee. They're alternating back and forth.
Yeah.
Bad piano playing notwithstanding. Okay. Then we build up to another climax. We have some scurrying lines in the string. And they build up to a big, giant chord. And then we cut to very soft bassoons and cellos and basses going. And what's interesting here is he actually does write it in 5/2, which is essentially the 10 bar that he was outlining earlier in the piece. He actually, because nothing else is happening here, I think he decided it would be more efficient to just put it in half notes. So it's 5 half notes instead of 5 quarter notes, which essentially makes it equal to 2 bars of 5 quarter notes.
Yeah.
Right? So if that confuses you. Basically, we're in half speed, but it's still in 5. So so much easier to conduct, in other words.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the build up. All right, this is like back to this foreboding material, and it builds up, and finally we come back and get to our and get back to the original material, but juiced up a little bit.
Yeah.
And the low brass really gets to let loose. Da, and everyone's hair gets blown back, and all the old ladies lose their dentures. It's pretty great. And the movement basically recaps what it did the first time through, and then ends with a giant, juicy organ chord, which I can't play because I literally don't have feet that I can play this with. Let's get our organ back again. And we go something like... It's just really clashing and intense. And then finally there's one last scurrying thing to the end, and then what's so interesting is the way this finishes. The whole, I guess the strings and the low brass all come together on this horrible chord they've been playing.
Yeah.
That's how it ends. It's just so epic. It just it's like just when you can't stand it anymore, it adds more intensity, and finally just it's one of the most satisfying endings to any piece ever. And so I think it's one of the greatest character pieces ever written. You know, and what I mean by character pieces, a piece of music that's meant to capture an idea or a feeling. Mm-hmm. And that's really what all these pieces in this work are. They're character pieces written in the largest scale possible. The planets, the universe, you know?
Yeah.
And this movement in particular, I think the fact that it opens with this, and it's such a perfectly constructed movement.
Yeah.
And it's so intense and exciting. It really sets the stage for the piece.
Yeah.
So, following Mars, we have to have contrast. And, you know, for all the, you know, sort of excesses, you could say, of Mars, Holst, I think, still is a composer of incredible restraint and control. He was not somebody who really liked to go overboard. And when he did so in a very controlled way. And, you know, Mars is very tightly written and constructed. You know, one of the anecdotes about Holst that you'd hear from his students was that the most likely thing he was going to do when he was critiquing your compositions is take things away. Mm-hmm. He didn't want things to be overdone or overblown. You know, it's very like aesthetic sort of British sensibility. Like, oh no, it's just sit here and get tea.
Too much.
It's too much. So, you know, I don't know what role that plays. You know, but
it's really good advice.
But he very much understood the need for contrast. After the intense opening of Mars, the next is Venus, the bringer of peace. Which, you know, Mars and Venus, they really are opposites, even in mythology. Mm-hmm. Although, you know, of course, in mythology, Venus is the goddess of love, whereas here she's the bringer of peace. So if you're born under the Venus, I guess you're gonna have a peaceful life. I don't know. So it opens with just a single instrument. It just opens with a single horn. Sorry. The solo horn. And then the flute's coming at the top. Play it. Piano playing, not 100% good, but you get the idea, right? So it's a single horn, and then just flutes and oboes over the top, just very, very sparse orchestration, just like a palate cleanser, and simple. What I love about this opening is it's so simple and serene, but the harmonies are interesting, right? You know, I mean, this is we go from something like F minor, mm-hmm. and then all of a sudden we're in D flat minor.
Yeah.
That doesn't go together. So already this kind of bitonality and this interesting juxtaposition of harmony, you hear this in every movement of this piece.
Yeah.
But the way he does it, he uses there's not many composers that you'll hear that uses harmonic clashing to create beauty in the way that Holst does. Somehow he takes these sounds and makes it more beautiful than music that doesn't clash. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know how he does it.
Yeah, usually like clashing chords are supposed to like evoke a tension or conflict.
Well, it's like, you know, it's like when you're eating sushi and you have some wasabi, and wasabi is like this really like, you know, it really hits you. You know, it's this unpleasant almost taste, but in the right amount, in the right context, it just makes the taste heavenly of the sushi. I want sushi. But we're not going to sushi. We're going to
Elmer's.
Regardless. And so to me, that's how Holst uses his clashes. You know, he's very in control of how he uses harmony. And it's so innovative. And that's, you know, it's something that maybe we take for granted now because we have music of these other composers to draw upon. And you could look at some other, you know, you could look at Wagner or Debussy as maybe other composers that, you know, predate Holst in some of these sort of ways of approaching harmony. But really, I think Holst was very influential just in the way he uses harmony. Mm-hmm. I just think it's so fascinating. And then following this introduction, we have, you know, the beautiful, you know, the cello's bass just sneaking. And then we have this back and forth in the harp. I can't play it very clearly, but it's something like.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it sounds really like French.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's definitely Debussy's influence here. Come back to this, same thing with the introduction. And then we have a second section that features the solo violin. So I can actually pull this out. We have a little violin break. So following this beautiful introduction, we have a little transition section, which I can try and play here. Beautiful chords, and then we end on this beautiful, beautiful chord. Let's see if I don't butcher it. It's something like okay, I butchered it. But we there's a nice little transition, and then we have a violin solo that's very awkwardly written for the violin. Very hard to play. And then we have all the violins come in. And what's so beautiful about the way he writes this, let's see if I can sing this somewhere, is it's all accompanied with just very simple, offbeat stuff in the oboes. So we have, so we're going. Yeah. So I'm not playing it correctly, but you get the idea. It's
I like that.
There's this just very simple texture that he uses. Following this, we have some beautiful oboe solo. Which alternates yada 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 da dee da yada dee da da. And then finally, we get back to our original material. We have a little bit of a recap of the violin solo, and then it ends with this really mysterious section that I just love, with these kind of shifting harmonies. You'll hear the sound of the harp, you'll hear the sound of the celeste, which is like a bell keyboard instrument, and just kind of this, it's very Debussy, the ending of this movement, and it just dies away. And another thing that I want to point out in this movement is this idea of alternating harmonies. Excuse me. This is something that Holst does throughout the planets in various spots. He'll take two harmonies and kind of go back and forth between them.
Yeah, like the trumpet harmony in the first movement.
Right. Well, and particularly in the Saturn movement, the bringer of old age, he uses it to really great effect. So just kind of keep it in mind that he's constantly doing this back and forth between two notes, and he'll do that with the harmony as well. So we're going let's see here, one example here. At the very end of this movement, we have. This harmony. Right? So, following Venus, we have the third movement, Mercury, the Winged Messenger. And this is a great example of the kind of bitonality and polytonality that Holst likes. So, just in the melody, you hear, we start in like a B flat major chord, and then immediately play an E major chord. So, those two chords together, that's the clash.
Yeah.
That's where we're going. That's the tension in this piece. So B flat major and E major are not closely linked at all in harmony. What's really interesting is if you look at the score, it looks like a mess because some instruments don't have a key signature, some instruments have two flats, and some instruments have three sharps. And there's no like rhyme or reason. It's basically just he knew that he was writing something in multiple keys at once, and he just decided to make it easier for the players And so there's places where people change key or change meter, and the rest of the orchestra doesn't even know. They just have to kind of like keep going. And so it makes it a little bit weird to rehearse.
It's like you're on your own planet.
Right, yeah. So I think, mercurial, right? The idea of the winged messenger as being changeable and constantly switching. That's the idea behind this. And I think it works really, really well because you really feel like it's just scurrying and moving. Now, another thing that this movement has a lot of are the hemiolas. So like in the first movement where you have rhythms that are contrary to the felt rhythmic structure of the movement, you have that a lot in this. So it starts out essentially 6/8. So 6/8 is 6/8 notes per bar, usually divided 3 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then we have dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da. He does the example that I gave you earlier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dee da 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 dee da. And so you'll hear that throughout this movement. Another thing he does is sometimes switches into quadruplets. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he'll suddenly go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Da, 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 for extra velocity.
Yeah.
In some of these, so you go dee da da dee da da dee da da. So it's really amazing the way he writes it. It's very tricky for the orchestra.
Yeah.
But you hear kind of this passing back and forth.
Yeah.
Another thing that's really interesting about this movement is he's taking these little figures and passing them from one instrument in the orchestra to another in quick succession. So someone has always got the running notes, but it's like a relay race where you're passing the baton or a hot potato.
So
I've got
as
it.
like a conductor, are you kind of like?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
It's my job to kind of keep tabs on everything and make sure I'm cueing everyone. I can't cue everyone, but there's definitely this feeling like it's just all over the place, which I think also is just a great way written into the music of evoking this sense of scurrying about, this winged messenger who's going from place to place. So, really fascinating. Finally, this introduction kind of comes back into just one note. Violins have really high or peak, and they start to go. Which is Morse code for I'm trapped inside a musical score. Please help. I don't know. It's this little rhythm that he repeats. It's like a 3-bar rhythm. It's interesting because it has that little hemiola in it. So we have da 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 dee 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 da 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 dee 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 dee. So again, it has this dance sort of feeling. And over the top of that, we have this cute little thing in the O's. I'm up, not so should we? Dee dee da 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 dee yum bum bing bum da 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 dee da 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 dee. So a very cute little figure.
Yeah, this is a cute movement.
And then we have another great violin solo here.
Is this one of those English folk tunes?
Well, not strictly speaking, but you can definitely hear that influence in this piece. It's funny because I've heard like German orchestras play this piece and just make it sound so German. It's wrong. This is a very British piece.
Yeah.
It's a very English piece in the way it's written. And I think it's important to bring that out. But what's great about this little melody is, again, it's bringing out that hemiola. Is that the baby?
That's the baby.
I thought that was a fire engine. It's up to you. Okay, so we took a little break because the baby woke up, but now we're back. So we were talking about Mercury. Basically, there's 3 ideas in this movement. There's da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-da, this alternating harmony that we talked about between these two. Do-do-da-dee-da-da. Then we have the second idea, which is this kind of cute little thing. And then the third idea is. And so between those 3 ideas, he kind of builds the movement and alternates between them. You'll also hear the harp in this movement. You'll hear the celeste, twinkling lights, and those sorts of things. There's a prominent section towards the end of the movement where the strings all playing in unison. This really hard passage where they're going something like. I'm gonna get a violin. Let's see if I can play this on the violin.
And break. And this is where I insert a sound, and then all of a sudden you have the violin in your hand.
So there's this really challenging passage. I can't even play it. It's really hard. All right, so all the strings have unison. They have these running into, and it's all very soft and requires a lot of focus and concentration in the strings. And at the very end, we have some really cute little parts in the celeste where it goes kind of. Twinkling up in the stratosphere, like twinkling little lights of the cosmos. So really a very special, lighthearted movement. And if you're thinking about these first four movements, you can almost organize them like they were a symphony, right? So the first movement is a fast, intense movement. Second movement is a slow, peaceful movement. Third movement is like a scherzo, right? So really this is the kind of joking sort of contrast. It's contrasting from the more serious first movement, but also it's a fast movement,
yeah.
So it's different from the second as well. And then the fourth movement, Jupiter, really fits into that symphony model, right? So most symphonies, you'd have a serious first movement that's fast, a slow movement second, a scherzo, joking fast movement third, and then a more serious fourth movement.
Yeah.
And that's really what we get here. Just set this down here. Don't let me step on this violin.
Okay.
So to start out with Jupiter, we have another hemiola. So we'll see these throughout. In this case, we're in 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But we have groups of 3/16 notes. So it doesn't line up with the bar line. It's just and we have a kind of parallel harmonies. It goes against the beat here, and on top of that, kind of exciting. It's the violins that do this. So creating energy and excitement, and then we have cellos, violas, and horns have the melody, right? So. So it's very excited and energetic and full of life. And then what's great about it is after the second statement of this opening theme, everything cuts off completely to silence, and then we have a giant chord. And the horns. And that little motive is another very important one that we're going to hear throughout. So basically this syncopated opening material is one of the main ideas of this movement. Another idea that we're going to hear a lot of is the second melody, which relates to the first, which is.
Yeah, that one's really recognizable.
Yes, so it's related in its shape, but it's a little bit more regular versus passing back and forth of eighth notes. This is a little bit more like a little English, country dance. And you even hear in the accompaniment in the brass, you'll hear the let's see if I can play this. Something like. So it's like a little dance section. Following that, we have a section that's in 3, which is a third idea, which is. Which is in the horns.
It's a great movement.
Yes, and so there's every idea here. They're contrasting ideas, but they all have this kind of jovial, pun intended, I suppose, attitude. And then we speed back up and we get back into our open material, get back into a 2 pattern, and then things kind of die down to a quiet spot, and we just hear the bits go. And over the top we hear woodwind passing around these little 8th notes in the background, and it's leading towards something, but we're not sure what. And then it stops, and suddenly we hear. So, this melody, which actually is like a hymn melody. In fact, even in Holst's lifetime, it was set to words.
Mm-hmm.
This is the core of the movement, and some would say this is the heart of the piece. This movement is right in the middle. It's got 3 movements before it and 3 movements after. And it's one of the, you could say, aside from Mars, it's the biggest movement.
Yeah.
And at the very middle of the movement, we have this really lyrical melody. It starts in the strings and horns, and then is taken up by full orchestra. And to me, what's so special about this melody is that it's unsingable. The way it's constructed, basically, there's kind of 2 halves to it. So we have the opening section. Here, you know it. Sing it.
I don't know the words.
There's no words.
Yeah.
No. Keep on going!
I can!
That's the point.
Yeah. And he always says this when we sing this hymn in church.
And then wait! It's still going. And then he ends it here because really it should go.
Right. Yeah.
It would keep on going.
Yeah.
So this is what's special about this melody. The way that the melody is constructed, it takes itself up an octave every time it
Yeah.
repeats. And it's a melody that doesn't actually have an ending. Like it's
Yeah.
a run-on sentence.
Yeah.
It's a run-on sentence that keeps on going, and just by the virtue of the way that the melody is written, it organically goes up an octave every single time it repeats. So in my mind, this melody, it's like the heavenly host is singing. It's this celestial hymn that is impossible for the human voice. No human voice exists that can sing this melody, or maybe very few. And if you kept it going, it literally would go on forever, up and up and up into heaven. And so rather than ending, he holds this kind of penultimate chord, and then cuts away to this shimmering little thing in the violins. He cuts away suddenly to English horn comes in,
Yeah.
and it cuts back to the other. It's almost like the final chord is like, that's heaven, but not yet.
Yeah.
It's not your time yet.
Yeah.
Like you get a little vision of the heavenly host singing this impossible hymn, and then it's not time yet. One day you'll come back here, and we go back, and we go back to the material from the beginning of the movement, unsatisfied. We never got a resolution because there is no resolution. And so we've recapped the opening, a lot of the same stuff. He does things a little differently the second time in that the little triplet melody is in a different key and it's much faster. So the first time he does it, ding dun ding 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 da ding dun ding dong bum bum, where essentially the quarter note stays the same. So we're going ba ba bee da 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 do da da ding ding da yum bum bum bum. The second time it happens, instead of the quarter note staying the same, the bar stays the same. So we're going ba ba bee ba ba bee ba ba bee ba ba bing bum bum bing bing bum bing bum 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 bum. So the overall measure beat stays the same.
Yeah.
And instead of being divided into 2, he divides it into 3. So it keeps it fresh and interesting. And then at the very end of this, there's a little coda section where there's this kind of sloshing of strings and woodwinds and harp up and down. And if you listen in the very bass line, you'll hear this trumpet. So we hear just a little snippet, like it's still out there somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, and we never get to hear that melody ever again. It
Yeah.
happens in the middle of the movement and then just goes away without ending. And we hear just a little taste of it at the very end. And then it's taken away again. And we have the final conclusion. Da 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 da, trumpets da da dee da dee. Wham! And it's so effective. It's just one of the great symphonic movements.
Yeah.
So exciting, so full of drive and energy. So
where do we go from there?
Oh no, what's wrong with this? It's down here. So we go to Saturn, the bringer of old age, right? So Holst is such a master of contrast, and in the same way that he contrasts between Mars and Venus, now he's had a couple fast movements. He needs another slow movement, but it can't be like Venus, peaceful. And so instead, it's like a creepy slow movement. The bringer of old age, inexorable approach of death. That's really what this movement is about. And so you hear in the opening the flutes. So we have two flutes on top and then an alto flute below. So alto flute has a very misty tone. It's a low flute. And this alternating. Remember I said that this alternating of chords was going to be useful, or not useful, but a theme?
Yeah.
So in the same way that in Venus, he does these alternating harmonies. He uses them here in Saturn to evoke the sound of a clock. Tick,
Yeah.
tock. Your end is coming.
Yeah.
Time is running out. And then underneath that, the melody, so this opening alternating happens in the harps and the flutes. Very stark, very minimal. And underneath it, just the double bass section. The string basses are going to, they just go. So it's this really kind of spooky, and then it starts to get passed around to the upper strings. Oboe. So it's very ethereal, and then we have a chord here in the horns, which kind of pauses everything for a second, and then we have a march in the pizzicato and the cellos and basses. And then in the trombones we have, let's see if I can play this. I'm in the wrong octave. It's a march. Oh, baby's crying. So beam, boom, beam, boom. Oh, da dee dee da start to build momentum, right? So
Right.
there was a slow introduction, and then this march starts to gain traction and build towards something until finally, as it gains intensity and volume and more instruments come in, we have these big pillars of sound, and we get back to this opening, which was so soft, but now it's huge. Yum, boy, yum, boy, yum, boy, yum, boy, yum, boy, boy, boy. This ding, dong, alternating the clock. And then, in the middle of this, he just completely cuts to a different tempo. Inda, 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 inda. And this clanging of bells, right? Let's see if I can play this chord. It's like a... here we go. So... This mayhem between this contrast between these pillars, these ancient pillars of sound, and then the clanging of bells. Your time is almost up. So for me, this movement is about death, and so it's fascinating to me the way he uses this slow progression, this slow build, to create a slow movement that is extremely exciting.
Yeah.
And has a huge amount of energy. So then following that, things die away just as kind of gradually as they built up. And then we have this delicate final section where the harps come in, again with this alternating, something like a... The harps playing harmonics back and forth, and then the basses come back, but now it's much more gentle because it's like we dreaded death, but maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's okay to go to rest,
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's what this is about,
Mm-hmm.
and it's this letting go.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the end of this movement is, and it's always sounded to me, there's a little bit of a bizarre connection. It's always sounded kind of like a Japanese gamelan ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
If you ever listen to Japanese gamelan, I don't know if Holst intended that. I know that Debussy heard Japanese gamelan and was influenced by it, and in turn Holst was influenced by Debussy. So
Right.
maybe you can find the relationship there. I don't know. But to me, the way he scores this with the harp and the harmonics and this alternating harmonies, it really sounds, if you look up sound of that, and it just slowly fades away. Very similar to how Venus was, just these gradual harmonies alternating, and that brooding theme for the very opening becomes this gentle theme of letting go. And it's just so beautiful, and it fades away into the distance. I also think, there's another great example of the way that Holst uses this scale and the sense of, he creates this sense of space that I think this piece does better than almost any piece, that I think really suits the planets themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The images of the planets.
Infiniteness.
It feels so vast, like you're just in this ocean of sound. And the way he does that is it's remarkable. There are a few other composers that could do that, like Debussy is a great touchstone for this piece. But
and yet there's a form, there's a pacing, there's a
and
there's
Holst,
a direction.
And Holst is a composer who struggled with symphonic forms, and so I think the fact that each movement is its own character really helped him to construct this piece and gave him a lot of inspiration for it.
Yeah.
But it's very meticulously laid out the way that he structures this piece and paces it, and that's why it's so great to listen to. It's because every movement feels right in the moment that it happens.
Yeah.
Moving on, movement 6, Uranus, the magician, or as some would say, Uranus. I have chosen to say Uranus because I'm grown up.
Back in my day, we said Uranus.
Well, so the magician. So this is another very interesting contrast. This is another fast movement, but this is another scherzo, really. So the first movement is a serious fast movement, then we have a slow movement, third movement is a scherzo, then we have a kind of a serious but happy fourth movement, then another slow movement, and then now we have another scherzo, and the last movement will be a final slow movement. So he's got 3 slow movements overall, 4 fast movements, 2 of them scherzos, 2 of them not. So it's interesting, he is constantly varying up the type of movement.
Yeah.
To create this constant sense of contrast. So, Uranus, the magician, another trickster, but this is a very interesting way. Instead of this kind of scurrying sound, he opens it with brass, low brass going. And then, oh, sorry. So there's a statement of the trumpets and trombones, then the tuba responds. So dee ba 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 dee doo da da, and then the timpani literally has these notes spelled out, and it cuts off. You know, it's just like it's such a great. You know, the magician comes out. He's good. He pulls the cape in front of his face or something, disappears in a puff of smoke.
Yeah.
You know, it's just so like theatrical.
Yeah.
I love how theatrical this is because you know it's Uranus the magician, and the word magician. You know, on the one hand you have like a wizard, a sorcerer, but it's also like a performer.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that there's this element
Yeah.
of theatricality.
Doves.
Yes,
And
exactly.
rabbits being pulled out of hats.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
from here, there's a complete cutoff, and the bassoon's going. It's it's often drawn comparison with The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Right.
You have the bassoon. It's very, very similar. Burping this episode. Sorry, it's gross.
You burped in the last one too.
Yeah. Did I burp in the last one?
Yeah, because you were drinking coffee, so you're just burpy.
I guess well, when I get excited, I think just the, I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, so we have this bassoon, and it builds up. That's the main theme here, rather the contrasting theme with ding, dun, dun, dun. So there's going to be a constant going back and forth. So we ding, da, dee, da, dee, da, da. Dee da dee doo da da, and there's that hemiola again, right? Because we're in 6/8, or actually 6/4, because they're quarter notes, but it's the same thing. Do da dee da dee da da. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, and then dee da 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 dee da dee da. So that hemiola is where we get the opening theme brought back in. You'll also hear the xylophone in this movement, ding 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 ding, which just kind of adds to the spooky character and just adds a lot of flavor, which I really like. And so you'll hear a lot of kind of that hemiola throughout this, and then we have a contrasting middle section. There's a couple of contrasting themes. So we have da 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 dee da 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 dee da da dee da 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 dee. Let's see if I can play it because I'm really good at singing. Yeah, so it goes. Here we go. It's hard to play it, but it's a kind of a cute little counter melody. And then we have which is kind of another contrasting melody. What's interesting about this, as well as the opening theme, is it makes use of the whole tone scale and the augmented triad, which are both musical elements that are often associated with magic in music. So this opening theme we had, if I put all those notes together, it spells out an augmented 7th chord. That's an augmented triad with the 7th on it. And that augmented chord is very often associated with magic.
Yeah.
Can we get the tambourine this time?
Mariko's she's playing the percussion in the piece.
There's no percussion in this piece of the
Okay, tambourine break. All right. So this triad, right, is a augmented, which is meant to sound magical, and you can also build an augmented triad when you make a whole tone scale. So musical scales are constructed out of what we call whole steps and half steps, and a half step is like 2 notes directly next to each other on a piano.
Yeah.
You put them together, they clash a lot, and you can play a scale completely out of half steps. That's called the chromatic scale. is not skipping any notes in the piano.
Right.
A whole step is when I skip one note. So, right, I'm skipping this note. That's right in between.
Yeah.
Just playing, skipping one note on the piano. And so most scales, major and minor scales, are constructed out of a combination. So like a major scale is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. A minor scale would be whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. Right, so we combine these whole steps and half steps in different order, and it creates these different scales. The whole tone scale is a scale comprised completely out of whole steps. So kind of like the chromatic scale, which is completely half steps. There's a chromatic scale. The whole tone scale sounds like this. Which sounds a lot like you're like going into like a dream sequence, you know, you're going like right? And so traditionally that's been something that's associated with magic, right? It's this kind of ethereal sounding thing. And if you look at the whole tone scale, you can actually build a augmented triad based on the fundamental pitch. So if we're doing an A whole tone scale, right, our chord that we hear at the beginning of this piece it fits within that scale.
Right.
So you could say that the whole tone scale and the augmented triad are closely linked. They're basically made out of the same musical material. And so Holst is using that to kind of bring the idea of the magician to life. So he uses that as the basis for his opening kind of theme, dee da dee ba, and then this theme here. It's not completely whole tone. So you'll hear there's two half steps. There's dee, 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 da, that's a half step, but then the rest of it is whole steps. And then when he goes back down, he deletes this half step and turns it back into a whole step. And then adds a different half step up here. But so there's two spots where he deviates to make it kind of have some shape to it. But you'll still hear he covers an entire whole tone scale over the course of this melody. So again, it's meant to sound magical and otherworldly. And so this builds up to a huge climax, and then we kind of die back down until we get to dee da 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 one more time. And then we have a march. And this march is interesting because it kind of, so we have this alternating figure in the lower part of the orchestra. And the upper instruments are going to alternate. So it's kind of this uneven march rhythm. And over the top of this, we have our secondary theme for this movement, which is here comes the magician. It's just irresistible. It's so humorous and full of just energy and joy, and kind of, I love it.
And humor.
So it really, again, brings out the scherzo character. Just as in Mercury, there's a lot of humor in this movement. And there is also a little bit of a militaristic feel in this march, kind of like bringing back some of Mars. But it's more joking. It's not as serious of a war sort of thing. And then here and there, you'll hear the timpani come back in with this, bringing out that opening theme. It's not very often you get melodies in the timpani of the drums that are tuned. This piece uses 6 timpani. Well, most pieces use either 3 or 4 drums. This piece uses 6 drums with 2 players. And there's parts where he literally spells out entire melodies between the 2 players. Where literally between the 2 of them, they're playing every note of a melody, which is almost unprecedented. Almost no composer that I can think of does that. Like the only other example I can think of is Nobuo Uematsu, the composer of the Final Fantasy games. And the only reason he can do it is because he was using a computer that can make a fake timpani sound. Practically speaking, it's very hard to actually make a real melody in a timpani drum because you only have a few pitches. But if you have enough drums and enough people who play those drums, you can actually spell out entire melodies in the drums, which he does at several points throughout this piece. So just
Especially
interesting.
with like a whole tone scale.
Yeah, it's a very unusual way of using the timpani,
Yeah.
but I think it is very effective.
Yeah.
Right. Finally, this march builds up to a huge climax, and you have some big alternating chords at the end. Ding, bong, crashing chords, and then a giant glissando in the pipe organ, as if he's waving his magic wand, and then it cuts down to just the violin section just going. Just like it. Alright. So I'll give you a little bit more of this chord. Just it's quiet little chord. And then in the distance you hear the harp. Low harp. And then you hear the harp just pinking in the distance. You know, like nothing happened. And then beep boom, 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 beep boom. Woodwinds come back and the timpani. And everything comes in for one final scream, and then it dies away. And at the very end, you hear the harp once more. And it's over. So, great movement.
Yeah.
Love, and it's fun. It's funny because there are many performances where people will perform just like the first few movements of this. The last three movements of this symphony or this piece are so great, and I love every single one of them.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a great movement.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, the last movement, Neptune, the mystic. Right. So we had magician and the mystic. Those are different things, right? So being mystical and being a magician are different. You know, mystic, I think, in the sense of like mysticism.
Like they see the future?
Like,
Is that right?
so mysticism in the sense of like think like Tibetan monk, you know, a spiritual sort of
Someone's
figure.
like connected to the universe.
Yeah, this ethereal, distant sage sort of character.
Yeah, got it.
And so, you know, connected with the spirituality of the cosmos. And so there's a very interesting, so this opening is flute and alto flute. It's this really interesting little harmony. And the thing that's really great about this movement is it's also in 5, just like the very first movement. So the first movement of this piece, the Mars, is in 5. So is this movement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. And so it's like the bookend, but it's so different. It's the opposite of Mars, and yet it somehow shares DNA with the Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at the opposite end of the spectrum. So I just think it's clearly intentional the way he does this. You don't do that on accident.
Yeah.
Right? So he's clearly tying the piece together in a very subtle way. Most audience members probably wouldn't even notice.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the score, you realize, oh, this is a very intentional way of tying the ends of the piece together. But again, it starts it very sparsely. And then we just have some very strange chords that clash with each other and alternate with one another. So I can't. It's hard for me to do it right now. But once again, he's using these dissonances to create this ethereal quality and intense sense of beauty. It's really amazing what he can do. So then we have kind of a intensification, more instruments coming in. You'll hear a lot of harp and just kind of swirling strings. And what's interesting about this movement is very little happens. Very little happens. There's this opening melody. And there's one other kind of sort of melody that kind of goes da 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 dee da da dee da da. But by and large, this is not a melody-driven movement. It's driven by chords. So there's a few spots with melody, and then you just hear these shimmering sonorities that trade back and forth slowly, just like swaying, and it's it's not, as much momentum as Mars had. This movement is all about stasis. Mm-hmm. And it's spectacular the way he creates these kind of walls of sound and these big chords that shift, and you'll hear these sparkling textures in the celeste and the harp. So then, partway through this movement, there's a change in tempo. So we were kind of 1, 2, and then all of a sudden we go back a little faster. And we have these kind of rising scales. And the woodwinds kind of rising, like smoke rising up. And then in the distance we hear the sound of the voice. And this is the big surprise in this piece, is that off stage somewhere is an entire female chorus. And they've been waiting the whole piece. And then you don't even see them, you just hear. Can you give us?
Like that? Like
that? That's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's exactly, they're off stage. Can't sing that note, right? And so the rest of this movement features this chorus, and the way he writes it, it's like this overlap, it's like the waves of the ocean, is the best way I could describe it. These kind of... these lines that overlap and echo each other, just one over the other, like the waves washing back and forth. And the orchestra just very delicately accompanies and creates these textures. Believe it or not, there's a spot where the pipe organ comes in this, with the pedals just creating this, again, this sense of space. This is the depths of outer space, the farthest distance, this planet that we can only dream of. Now we've taken pictures of it, but even today, Neptune is not a well-explored planet in our solar system. It's just so far away. Yeah. And there's, scientists are still discovering things about these planets that are just so far away and hard to get to. And so we can only just kind of dream what it's like out there. And so you really hear the expanse of space in this movement. And this kind of, to me, it kind of evokes the feeling of the ocean. But I think that's an apt metaphor for the infiniteness of space. And of course, now we know that these planets are ice giants. Uranus and Neptune. And so, there's this kind of cold, distant character. Far away, and you can feel amidst the twinkling stars. Mm-hmm. The end of this movement features something actually pretty notable in music history. It's the first real fade out of musical history. We've all heard a million different, pop songs and rock songs that fade out, but it's hard to do that in classical music because everyone's like there. You can't just turn the volume down. But Holst finds a way to do it. So the very last measure of this piece features nothing except for the choir. So the orchestra gradually fades out until in the very last bar, there's nothing left but the singers singing one bar on repeat. Right? So they've got this little harmony that I can try and play. Going back and forth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I remember doing this.
Yeah, you've sung it before.
Yeah.
So what he instructs you to do is it says this bar is to repeat it until the sound is lost in the distance. What the singers do is either you slowly swing the door shut, or you have the singers walk away into another room. There's a couple of different, depending on the space you're in. Yeah. So we still have to figure out how we're going to do it because we haven't rehearsed it with the choir yet.
Yeah, we did the door swinging shut.
Yeah, that's the traditional way to do it. Is like they swing the door shut until the sound is lost.
And then you have singers drop out. You have, you'll just have some people drop out and stop singing at a certain measure.
Yes, because if you just have the singers try to sing quieter, it changes the color. And so it sounds like singers just trying to sing quieter and stop.
And then inevitably you have like that.
Yeah, what Holst wants is the sound of, the sound is actually moving into the distance.
Away, yeah.
Until it's no longer perceptible.
Yeah.
At the end of this movement, and at the end of this piece, the audience should be left straining, wondering if they're just imagining that they can still hear it, or if they really can. And this is, this is a piece that ends in total silence, and everyone just holding and waiting, and you just have to hope that no one coughs.
Oh my gosh.
You have to hope that no one coughs, because it just should be. And then,
Get your cough drops out before the end of the last movement.
and then finally, the conductor relaxes, and people are allowed to clap. Now, I always feel that there's something that happens with pieces that have a quiet ending, that like the audience is like lulled into. Like it's kind of weird to clap. Like when you end a piece in a big loud manner,
You're like, yeah!
everyone's like, yeah, they'll jump to their feet.
Bravo!
You know, and so usually what happens with this piece is people go like, oh. And then they go crazy and they start standing up and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But it's so intimate the way he ends it,
Mm-hmm.
and yet also completely impersonal. Intimate in the sense that it's so small, but impersonal in the sense that like this is millions of miles away.
Yeah.
And it's unknowable, unseeable, unimaginable, and it's truly, truly magical. So I love this piece. I love every single movement. I love the way the movements relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way it ends. So it's really, really fun to conduct. It's fun for the orchestra. I've had so many people in the orchestra just tell me how excited they've been for this piece, how much fun they're having playing it. It's really hard.
Every movement has melodies and rhythms and things that you recognize. You know,
and there's stuff for everyone to do. This
Yeah.
piece, it's all hands on deck. Everyone, like, we're adding players to play this. There's parts that you know, a normal orchestra, you wouldn't have as many people. We have so many extra people, and everyone gets a cool part. Everyone gets something to do. I mean, the double basses have the melody. You know, like prominently. You know, there's so much to do in this piece, and so yeah, it's an amazing opportunity to be able to make this piece happen. It's been a dream of mine for many years to play this piece. And so I couldn't be happier doing it, so yeah.
Yeah.
You have any questions?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, like, calling back to what you said about how this piece was used as temp tracks for movies. You can really hear, like, I don't know, it was fun to kind of imagine, like, oh, I wonder, like, if this part was used for this really famous movie score that I've heard of, you know, like Star Wars or Harry Potter, or like it was funny. I even had this moment where I was thinking of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you know, like, and it's it'd be interesting to see what movies used this piece as a temp track, and then like go and listen to it
side by side
and listen side. Yeah, you were saying that there's some like.
But you can also hear just the influence.
Yeah.
So for instance, you could look at say like Lord of the Rings. There's huge influence of the planets into the way that Howard Shore wrote the score for that. I mean, think about like the beacons scene, the lighting the beacons. Da 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 da. And those orchestras just going crazy and building, and you know, that's like very influenced by the planets.
Yeah.
You know, it's become such a part of the language of film music that it's hard to like tease it apart at times.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure there are some direct references
Yeah.
that you can find if you search for them. On this concert, we're not just playing the planets. We're starting with the Italia Overture by Mendelssohn, which is not widely known, but it's a really great piece. And then we're playing the Barber Violin Concerto with soloist Anthea Creston, who's fantastic.
Who's great.
Barber Violin Concerto is one of my favorite pieces of all time. It's so, so, so beautiful.
Yeah.
So this is, I was telling you the other day.
This is going to be a great concert.
It's a very difficult program for the orchestra, but it's one of my favorite programs I've ever been a part of. I just love every piece on this program. So I think it's going to be a fantastic way to close out our season.
Yeah.
And then we'll be on to the next one, and hopefully we'll do more of these episodes.
Yeah, you know, and I was just thinking, like, you know, during the summer, you'll be like taking a break from Sunnyside for a little while. You won't be having concerts, right? So, you know, what should we talk about during the summer?
Well, we'll have to figure that out.
Yeah.
We'll have to figure that out. But there's definitely a lot of music out there that I'd love to talk about. So hopefully people have enjoyed this rambling version of the planets with very faulty piano playing. You know, it's just the way it goes. Hopefully you're used to it by now.
Yeah, but when you sing the part, it's so freaking entertaining.
Yeah, but I can't really make the pitches with my voice, so I have to try.
Stop saying that. You're doing great.
Well,
you can hear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for listening. Come see the concert May 4th at 4 p.m. It's a Sunday. It's at the Sunnyside Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is just off of 205 in Southeast Portland. And we hope to see you there.
All right.
That was a good one.